So, Mayor Bottoms, the world watched you lead the city of Atlanta through COVID, through social unrest and protest, some heart-wrenching violence and economic turmoil. And you officially stepped down as the 60th mayor of Atlanta in January. Post-term, how are you focusing your time?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you to the entire Bloomberg family. Bloomberg Philanthropies, Associates, Mike Bloomberg, great partners with the city of Atlanta. So I am figuring it out. I was at my desk in my home one day until about 9:30 at night, and I was telling my mother how tired I was. She said, "Well, what are you doing?" I said, "That's a good question." So I've had a couple of resets. They're only 24 hours in a day. And just getting back to normal. I'm speaking, I am doing commentating and all sorts of things, including taking my kids to basketball practice and carpool every day.
Got it. And you were on a short but very esteemed list to become vice president in 2020. Does the White House remain a goal for you?
Each time I have the honor of going to the White House, I feel like I'm going into Disney World. When you are in politics, it of course doesn't get any better than that. And it is such a magical place. And so I've been there a couple of times over the past month. I was just there last week, and I still have to pinch myself. So never say never. Right now I'm working on carpool, and we'll see what the future holds.
That sounds like a goal. I'm just going to call it, but.
Okay.
Beyond the White House, and just one more question about aspirations, because I spent some time, checking you out over the weekend just to look at the clips and everything. I never heard you say or rule return to political life out. Under which context would you return to the political scene?
I never thought I would run for mayor of Atlanta. It took a very long time for me to get comfortable with the idea of running for mayor. But just as certain as I was that I should run for mayor, I was just as certain that it was time to exit and put a period at the end of that season. And during my press conference, when I announced that I was not running, I said voters get to decide every 4 years, and so do I. And it is time to pass the baton on to someone else. So that's a very long way of saying, I don't know, but I will know when I know.
Got it. Okay, so let's pivot a little bit into elections, nationwide and in your state of Georgia. There's a lot of elections coming up. You've got 4 key posts in the state of Georgia: Secretary of State, House, Senate, Governor. We're going to talk about governor in a second, but I know you've said that you hope voters turn out. How concerned are you that people won't turn out, especially after the big voting rights legislative loss in January?
I'm very concerned, and for many reasons. And I say my best polling source goes between my mother and my college student, my oldest son. And when I look at my son, I look at someone who's not very satisfied, not mature enough to understand that there is a process and that it doesn't happen with just one election. He very much wants instant results. And I think that's reflective of a lot of people in America right now. But just as I'm constantly drilling into him, every single election counts. You just can't go and vote for president and then not come back. You've got to vote in local elections, state elections, federal elections. But it concerns me. And then on top of that, we have had massive voter suppression laws put into place in Georgia. Drop boxes have been restricted. The length of time that people can go and vote, early voting has been limited, and you can't even pass out water in line in June in Georgia. So I know that there's a lot of frustration, and then on top of that, we're still recovering as a country. So you have people going, well, what was that all about? Because I don't feel like my life is any better. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I know that's the sentiment. And so we've got to keep reminding people that it matters. And I posted something on Instagram yesterday saying, if you don't think elections matter, take a look at the confirmation hearings. This is what happens when you have the opportunity to show up and vote. Historic things can happen, but again, it's a process.
So what do you tell, not just is he 18-year-old, your son?
19.
19-year-old?
Almost 20.
Okay, your almost 20-year-old son and other voters in his age bracket. What do you tell them when they're on the fence or they're frustrated because it's not moving fast enough?
Well, my son, it's, you better go vote. And I'm going at 3 o'clock, and you better meet me there. That's what I tell him. But my more polite way is that, and I think of the words of Audre Lorde, revolution is not a one-time event. And especially in Atlanta, where we have such a deep and abiding connection to the civil rights movement led by young people, reminding them that there were students from the Atlanta University Center that literally changed the world, and that the power is still within their hands. And if they don't like what's happening, then go vote and change it.
But how does just widening the lens a little bit, how does the DNC and the Biden administration come back from a legislative collapse that happened in January in a way that fires up the base, in a way that the other Republicans have fired up the base?
Well, you know, when you take polls, it's a snapshot in time. So polls can swing from this way, they can swing that way. And I'm a living testament to that. When I ran for mayor, just a week before the election, I was 6 points down in the polls, and I ended up winning by a very slim margin. And I say that to say, I know a lot of people are looking at polls and looking at where President Biden may be in the polls and believe that that's going to be reflective in the midterms, but I don't receive that. And what I know is that the DNC is continuing to do the work, continuing to invest money in communities towards countering the voter suppression efforts, towards registering voters, towards the messaging efforts. And in the midst of the horrible tragedy that's happening in Ukraine, I believe voters are taking a fresh look at our president and what he has to offer as a leader. And I believe that people will be satisfied with that come the midterms if we stay the course and remind people of things that have been done. So it's incumbent upon us to approach messaging, not in necessarily the traditional ways. I talk about my mother. My mother needs to get a phone call. She needs to get a mailer. She's gonna watch television. She's gonna see the commercials. My 19-year-old, not so much. If it's not on his phone, on the screen, he's not gonna see it. So we've gotta make sure that the messaging on the American Rescue Funds and all these things that have been done for working families and for students, that messaging is drilled into voters as they go back in the midterms.
Okay, we're going to key up a voter poll, just a Twitter poll from the audience in just 1 second, but I have to ask one question. I was going to park it, but I'm going to ask you quickly about the business community, because I thought I heard when you were mayor, you were meeting with CEOs every quarter as sort of consulting with them. And I wonder, I'm watching what's happening in Disney with the LGBTQ bill, and I'm wondering, as part of your initiative to get voter turnout and, you know, voter rights generally, what kind of conversations are you having with the business community? Is there a way that they feel that they can afford to either stay on the fence or lean into the issue? What does that look like if it is happening at all?
Well, thankfully in Atlanta, we have been very proactive in engaging with our business community. So I would meet with our Fortune 500 CEOs. We have about 30 Fortune 500 companies in Atlanta once a quarter, and university presidents and presidents of our major healthcare systems in the city. And it's a very cohesive group. So those conversations are actively happening. And input is asked, what do you think about this? And also their suggestions, and it's a very healthy dialogue, and it's been great for our communities because we're talking about equity. They stood up vocational training in our city. They've helped fund a number of initiatives that have helped us move the needle in terms of equity. But what I would say is look at Georgia, again, as to what it can do to your bottom line if you aren't thoughtful about your policies. When many of these voter suppression bills were passed, the All-Star game was removed from Georgia. And I took that as a warning shot, that if we continue down this path, and we remember what happened in North Carolina with some of the efforts related to equality, that this can be the case in Georgia, and I would expect that it could possibly be the case if Disney is not thoughtful about the position that it takes. And I think that really is a lesson for CEOs across the country, that if you want people to be consumers of your product and visit your locations, then you have to be thoughtful about policies that you may be silent about. Again, Audre Lorde, whom I love, your silence will not protect you.
You know, these companies, just real quick, are these companies willing to put their face to the idea that they're supporting these measures? Or is the feedback you're getting they want to stay behind the scenes?
Well, I don't think most business leaders want to get into politics. It can be very complicated. And again, I go back to Georgia. Delta Airlines had a gas tax in Georgia, and when there were some disagreements with the governor and the leadership on some issues, they tried to pull back on the gas tax. So it can be a very difficult conversation, but sometimes you can't avoid the conversation. There are times when personally and professionally and as leaders, you have to speak up when it's not the most opportune moment, but it's necessary.
Okay, let's go to the polling question, if we can pull that up. The question being...
And as you pull that up, I'll just give an example. When Martin Luther King Jr. was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Atlanta, or the Nobel Peace Prize, there was a conversation in Atlanta about whether or not he would be received at home. And it was Robert Woodruff, the Coca-Cola family, who said, we will receive him, and we will do it in an integrated manner at an integrated dinner. And, you know, that was this moment in time where the world had awarded Martin Luther King Jr. for his efforts, but even at home, we were still dealing with segregation in the city, and it was a renowned business leader who stood up and made a difference in our city.
Okay, so we have, I don't know if that's coming up, I guess it's coming up here. So the question is, the polling question is, which issue needs more attention when it comes to voting rights reform? And the answer that got the most, 68.6% said ending gerrymandering. That was the #1 issue that needed the most attention, followed by voting accessibility, followed by advocacy at 6.4%. Voting accessibility is 25%. Is that the way you would have ranked?
I would agree with that. And Ambassador Young shares his story quite a bit about when he ran for Congress, and rained all day. There was one day of voting, and there was a 70% turnout. And 90-year-old Ambassador Young cautions us not to let the efforts to limit our access to voting stop us from voting. what he says, and I'm paraphrasing this, no matter what they do, if you have the ability to show up, it's still your obligation to show up and vote.
I want to talk about the black vote specifically, but before I want to talk about a video where you said that you would do everything in your power to make sure that Stacey Abrams is elected the next governor of Georgia. So I wanted to ask you specifically about how you're working with Ms. Abrams and what you're doing to support her candidacy.
Well, one, we need Stacey Abrams as governor of Georgia. That's a period. And I am awaiting my marching orders. You know, campaigns are very complex. You don't want to get ahead, and you certainly don't want to mess it up. So I am awaiting my marching orders, but really there's been a Republican fight in Georgia. The governor is being primaried by Senator Perdue. So they've been battling it out, and now you're starting to see Stacey Abrams' campaign become more active. So I am sure I will have some marching orders very soon. But right now, I am just reminding people to register to vote and to show up to vote. And as we get closer to the primary, I'm sure there'll be a whole lot more for me to say.
Okay. Yeah, which takes us right back to the first question about next steps, but we will be watching that. The black vote. So I want to ask about that. You know, President Biden got 87% of the black vote back in 2020. We've seen an erosion in his approval rating with the black demographic. I think it was down to 60% in one of the recent major polls. That was down from 73%. And same in terms of the black approval rating for congressional Democrats. It's also at 60% down somewhat. So my question is, how do you make sure you are doing everything to keep the black voter motivated?
Again, it goes back to messaging and making sure that people understand what's being done on their behalf. We were in a room with Congresswoman Nakima Williams and some other folk from the DNC and a group of college students from Spelman, Morehouse, Clark, Atlanta University, Georgia State, you name it. We got a lot of schools in and around Atlanta. And one young man was lamenting that nothing's been done. And someone asked the question, did you get a check recently? And he said, yeah. And they said, well, where do you think the check came from? And he said, I don't know. I don't know. and as we talked, he thought that it had come from his school, and the person said, no, that came through the Biden administration. So my point being, there are things that are being done that are making the lives of people better. But if we aren't messaging that, and if people don't understand what those things are, and it's not just about handing out a check, it's about policies, and there's work being done, and we now have this amazing, accomplished woman sitting before the Senate having confirmation hearings to be appointed to the Supreme Court. We have to message that and remind people of that, especially in the black community, because we were an important part of the last election cycle as a voting bloc.
And by we, who are we, just to be clear?
Everybody. I mean everybody, from the DNC to our state officials, to our local officials. We have to speak what's happening that's benefiting our communities. And we've got to do it in a way that people will receive that information. I remember during the campaign, my 11-year-old son's a big NBA fan, so he's always watching something NBA related on YouTube. He's 11. And I walked by, and I kept seeing Donald Trump commercials coming in. And what it said to me, and I knew this, but it confirmed it for me, that there was this alternative messaging geared toward making sure that whether it's my 11-year-old, 14-year-old, 19-year-old watching YouTube, that they would be unhappy with what was happening. So it wasn't about people, it was about suppressing the vote, getting people to stay at home. And I suspect that's going to happen again. And I think in the same way that we've seen right-wing groups perfect this alternative messaging, I think that we have to be very thoughtful about how we message. My 19-year-old's not going to watch the press conference on CNN, but he will get it if he's watching YouTube or if it comes through on Snapchat or any number of other things that I don't know how to watch and work.
I've got 100 more questions, but unfortunately we don't have that much time. But I do want to hit this question of housing affordability in Atlanta because it's a hot market right now. It's a hot market, especially for investors who've been snapping up properties and houses. I think in the last quarter, a third of all houses sold went to investors, driving up prices by 22%, on top of the fact that you've got inflation, which is one of the highest in the country. So my question, you had a very ambitious plan to address this issue of housing affordability when you were mayor. How do you even begin to crack that issue when you see that kind of data?
We had a plan for $1 billion invested and to create and/or preserve 20,000 housing units by the year 2026. We were, I believe, close to $700 billion in investment at the end of my $700 million at the end of my first term, or close to it at least. And we were close to, I believe, 9,000 units created and/or preserved. So the Bloomberg family, Bloomberg team was incredible in helping us craft a plan, creating the metrics, one, so that we could measure it, that we could get everybody in the same room to have the discussion on how we create and preserve affordable housing, and it gives us an opportunity to expand that discussion. So while we were having it internally and with our public stakeholders, now we can have these conversations with an even broader group, roll out this plan to others and say, this is what we're trying to do. And if it's not happening in your city, this is how you do it. This is how you measure it. Because a lot of people care about housing affordability, not just people who can't afford to live in our city. When I would talk with CEOs about it, they cared about it because the people worked in their office or their assistant was driving an hour and a half to work. They cared because their second grader's teacher didn't live in the city. The Republican lawmakers cared because they had to come into the city for 3 months during the legislative session to live in the city. So there were a lot of interested partners that you otherwise wouldn't think would be interested that were willing to help us work on that issue. And I know that can happen. If it happened in Atlanta, it can happen everywhere.
So it's sort of an advice angled piece before we wrap, but for the future female mayors listening or watching you right now, what would you tell her about what it takes to lead a major U.S. metropolis, knowing what you now know post-COVID and post-George Floyd?
There is more in you than you can ever begin to imagine. And it's often when you are in the fire that your ability to lead comes out most. We lead as women, we just often don't call it leadership. We think it's something else. We think it's just what we do. But there is an ability for so many women to do it the highest seat of government, to do it locally, to do it at any level. And if we don't take our seat at the table and articulate our issues and those cares and concerns that impact us every day and impact our families and communities, if we don't hold that seat down, nobody's going to speak for us. So what I would say to women across the country is go for it and don't be afraid.
Mayor Bottoms, thank you very much.
Thank you.